Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into medieval India today.
Oh, an exciting era.
It really is. We're focusing on the rise of the Delhi Sultanate.
That's 1206 to 1526 CE. Right.
You got it. It's a period of sweeping empires and fascinating cultural blends, so
I'm ready to get into it.
me too. But before we get to the Sultanate itself,
Yeah.
what did India look like before 1206 CE?
Okay, so picture this. You've got this network of regional kingdoms.
Like a patchwork.
Exactly. And each one with its own unique identity and power dynamics. You had powerful dynasties like the Cholas down south.
Weren't they big on maritime trade?
Huge. Their influence stretched all the way to Southeast Asia. And then you had the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan.
I've heard about them. They
Yeah.
had a really sophisticated administration, right?
Very much so. So basically, it wasn't a unified India.
It was more like a complex web of kingdoms, each with its own thing going on.
Yeah, exactly. Which is super important to remember because the Delhi Sultanate didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right. They had to navigate these existing power structures.
Exactly, making their rise even more interesting.
So let's get to that rise. 1206 CE entered the Delhi Sultanate. But hold on, this wasn't just one big happy empire, was it?
No, not at all. We're talking about 5 different dynasties, all vying for control over a span of over 300 years.
Wow, 5 dynasties. That sounds like a recipe for some serious power struggles.
Oh, for sure. Each dynasty had its own ambitions and strategies for holding on to power.
So it was a pretty dynamic period, huh? With alliances shifting and rulers constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
You got it. It makes this era so fascinating to study.
Absolutely. So walk us through this. Did each dynasty leave its own unique mark? Like, how did they approach ruling this vast and diverse region?
Oh, absolutely. While military strength was key, of course, they also had to be smart.
You mean politically savvy?
Totally. They were really good at incorporating local rulers into their administration.
So instead of wiping out the existing power structures, they kind of absorbed them?
Yeah, in a way. It was a way to maintain stability and control.
That's a clever strategy.
Yeah.
If you can't beat them, join them. Or at least bring them into the fold, right?
Right.
But it wasn't just all about political maneuvering, was it? The sultans were known for their stunning architecture, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The architecture of the Delhi Sultanate is truly impressive. Their buildings weren't just functional, they were statements.
Symbols of power.
Exactly. They really showcased the dynasty's authority and the changing cultural landscape.
And one of the most iconic examples has to be the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi.
Oh, definitely. It's one of the earliest surviving mosques from that period, and it tells us so much about this era.
It's incredible, right? Like the way they incorporated those repurposed columns from Hindu and Jain temples.
Yes. And the intricate carvings, the sheer scale of the structure, it's like a fusion of styles.
A real blend of Islamic and Indian architectural elements. I remember visiting it and just being in awe.
I can imagine. It wasn't just a matter of imposing a completely foreign style. That blend, using elements of existing Indian architecture, shows they were making a conscious effort to adapt to the landscape.
It's almost like they were saying, look, we're here to stay and we're going to be a part of this cultural fabric.
Yeah, exactly.
Which makes me wonder, what was life actually like for everyday people during the Sultanate? Because it couldn't have just been emperors and grand mosques, right?
Oh, definitely not. Historical sources actually give us these little glimpses into the social structure back then.
Oh, it's interesting.
There are records of land grants to religious figures and big landowners, which hints at an elite class.
Makes sense. Power and wealth usually go hand in hand.
Right. But there are also mentions of all sorts of professions, cultivators, artisans.
So it wasn't just a simple two-tier society. There was complexity there.
Oh, absolutely. It was a diverse economic structure for sure, but it does suggest a social hierarchy.
One that probably evolved through the interactions of different groups and, like you said, those pre-existing norms.
You got it. And we can imagine bustling marketplaces, with artisans selling their goods and farmers bringing their produce to town.
And religious scholars probably debating different ideas.
Exactly. So it wasn't a static society, but a dynamic and interconnected one.
Which makes me think, how did this society interact with a wider world? Was the Sultanate part of the global trade networks back then?
Oh, 100%. The Delhi Sultanate was plugged right into those networks. They had these bustling trade routes connecting them to lands way beyond their borders.
So imagine caravans loaded with spices, silks, precious metals, all traveling vast distances.
Exactly. Linking India with the Middle East, Central Asia, even Europe.
It's mind-blowing to think about those ancient trade routes, like The Silk Road, for example, with merchants traveling thousands of miles exchanging goods and ideas, it's like a precursor to our modern globalized world, isn't it?
It really is. It's fascinating to think about how interconnected the world was even back then.
Totally. So what were the specific goods that India was known for exporting during that time?
Well, India was famous for its spices, of
Oh,
course.
like pepper and cinnamon. Those were super valuable back then.
Very much so. And textiles, like those fine cotton and silk fabrics. And then you have precious stones, agricultural products like cotton and sugar.
Wow, a real treasure trove. It sounds like India was a major player in the global economy back then.
Absolutely. Their goods were highly sought after all over the world.
So it wasn't just about bringing wealth into the Sultanate. It was about India's unique contributions to the world, right?
Precisely. And those contributions had ripple effects that went way beyond just the economic side of things.
Oh, I bet. That's where it gets really interesting for me. It wasn't just about goods changing hands, was it?
You're right, it wasn't just about economics. These trade routes were like cultural highways, too.
Oh, interesting. Like what kind of cultural exchange are we talking about here?
Ideas, artistic styles, even religious practices traveled along with those goods.
It's like a two-way street.
Exactly. They shaped the culture of the Sultanate and the regions it connected with. It wasn't just economic, it was a dynamic exchange that left its mark on both sides.
That makes me think back to the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque and how it blended those architectural styles. Was that kind of give and take happening in other areas too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's woven into the whole Sultanate story. Take language, for instance.
Okay, what happened with language?
Well, Persian was the language of the administration in the Sultanate,
Right.
but it started incorporating all these words and phrases from local Indian languages.
So it was like a linguistic fusion was happening.
Exactly. And it happened a lot, especially in empires that were spread out over so many different places.
Right, it makes sense. It wasn't just everyday language either, right?
No, no. Like, you started seeing new literary genres popping up that blended Persian and Indian storytelling traditions.
Wow, so it really shows how creative and adaptable people can be when different cultures meet, right?
For sure. It challenges the idea of the Delhi Sultanate as just this rigid, imposing force.
Yeah, instead it seems like this dynamic, evolving entity.
Exactly. It wasn't just about conquest. It was about creating these new hybrid forms and traditions.
It's a testament to the power of that cultural exchange. So we've touched on architecture, cultural blending, the booming trade. But what about the economic impact of the Delhi Sultanate? How did their rule affect India's economy?
Interestingly, their arrival kind of coincided with a period of major economic growth for India.
Oh, really? So they were in the right place at the right time.
You could say that, and part of it was definitely fueled by that global trade we were talking about.
Okay, so those caravans loaded with spices and textiles weren't just a pretty sight. They were bringing in some serious cash.
They were. And remember, the Delhi Sultanate controlled key trade routes.
Right, on both land and sea.
Exactly. So they were connecting India to these really profitable markets in the Middle East, Central Asia, even Europe.
So what were the big ticket items? What was India really known for back then?
Oh, the variety is amazing. You've got your spices, of course.
Like pepper, cinnamon, things like that?
Yes, and textiles like those fine cotton and silks we were talking about, plus precious stones, agricultural products like cotton and sugar.
Sounds like a land of abundance.
It was a treasure trove for the rest of the world.
It wasn't just about filling the Sultanate's coffers, though, was it? I mean, this trade must have had a big impact on Indian society.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to look at those ripple effects,
What kinds of things?
Well, for one, it led to the growth of cities, the rise of a whole merchant class, even agricultural practices changed.
How so?
Well, farmers started growing crops specifically for export. So it's a great example of how economic forces can actually reshape a whole society.
It sounds like the Delhi Sultanate's influence was massive, from the grand architecture to the everyday lives of farmers and merchants. But it couldn't have all been easy, right? I mean, governing a realm that big and diverse had to come with its own set of headaches.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Governing any empire, let alone one as diverse as this, always has its challenges.
Like what?
There were rebellions, power struggles.
So they were constantly having to adapt just to stay in control.
Exactly. It was a constant balancing act, trying to keep all those different pieces together.
And with a society that diverse, there must have been tensions to navigate.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the biggest was religion.
Right, because you had Muslim dynasties ruling over a largely Hindu population.
Exactly.
That seems like a recipe for conflict. Did it actually lead to clashes?
Well, there were definitely instances of conflict, even persecution, which is a dark side to any historical period.
Of course. But was it all doom and gloom?
No, not at all. It's important to remember that this period also saw some incredible examples of religious coexistence and even syncretism.
Syncretism. What do you mean by that?
So in this case, syncretism means the blending of different religious traditions.
Oh, I see.
Like, for example, you had the emergence of Sufi Islam.
Sufi Islam. That was a more mystical branch of
Yeah.
Islam, right?
Yes, and it actually incorporated elements of Indian mysticism. And then you also see these local cults developing that combined Hindu and Islamic practices.
Wow. So even amidst those inherent tensions, there was still this cultural dialogue happening.
There was. People were finding ways to bridge those divides and create new forms of religious expression.
It's a reminder that history is never just black and white.
It really isn't. The Delhi Sultanate story is full of these contradictions and complexities, full of both conflict and coexistence.
It highlights the fact that people are incredibly adaptable, even in times of huge change.
Absolutely. And speaking of change, I think we need to talk about the eventual decline of the Delhi Sultanate. After over 300 years, why did this powerful empire eventually fall apart? It's a question historians are still trying to fully answer. It wasn't just one thing.
More like a perfect storm of challenges.
Exactly. Internal divisions and power struggles definitely played a big role.
So as the empire grew, different factions started vying for control,
They did, and that weakened the central authority.
almost like a centrifugal force pulling everything apart from within.
Perfect analogy. And then on top of all that, you had pressure from outside forces.
Like invade.
Well, by the 16th century, you have this new power on the rise, the Mughal Empire.
Led by Babu, right? The founder of the Mughal dynasty.
That's him. And he was a force to be reckoned with.
So how did the Sultanate fare against this new threat?
Well, Babu's armies had gunpowder technology, innovative military tactics. They were a tough opponent, especially for a sultanate that was already weakened by internal strife.
I can imagine. So what was the final blow?
The Battle of Panipat in 1526. It marked the end of an era, the fall of the Delhi Sultanate, and the rise of the Mughals.
So a combination of internal weakness and external pressure led to their downfall. It's a familiar story in history, isn't it? Empires rise and fall.
It is. But before we jump completely to the Mughals, I think it's worth reflecting on the legacy of the Delhi Sultanate.
Definitely. It wasn't just a blip on the radar. It had a lasting impact, right?
Oh, absolutely. Its legacy extends way beyond its political boundaries and continues to shape India even today.
So what are the key takeaways? What should we remember about the Delhi Sultanate as we move forward in our exploration of Indian history?
Well, I think it gives us these really valuable insights into how cultures interact and adapt and the power of historical legacies.
Right, because it wasn't just a foreign imposition on India. It transformed the political, cultural, and economic landscape.
Exactly. And that influence is still visible today.
It's in the monuments, the languages, even the social structures.
It really is. Think about all those architectural wonders like the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque, the Qutb Minar, the tombs and palaces across the north.
They're like tangible reminders of the Sultanate's presence even centuries later.
They are. And remember when you visited the Qutb Minar?
Oh, yeah. The sheer scale of it, those intricate details, it was like stepping back in time.
Exactly. And it's not just the physical structures. The Sultanate's influence is woven into the languages spoken in India today.
You're talking about Urdu, right? That beautiful blend of Persian, Arabic, and Hindi.
Exactly. Urdu emerged during the Sultanate period, and it became this major language for literature, poetry, even everyday conversation.
Wow. It's like a living, breathing testament to that cultural fusion we were talking about.
It is. And like the architecture, this linguistic legacy is a tangible reminder of the Sultanate's impact.
It's amazing how languages evolve and adapt, reflecting those cultural exchanges throughout history.
It really is. And the impact goes beyond language and architecture, too. The Delhi Sultanate also left its mark on administration and political structures.
So they weren't just focused on building mosques and writing poetry. They were shaping how India was governed.
Exactly. They introduced new ideas about administration, taxes, land ownership, and many of those innovations were adopted by later rulers.
Like the Mughals.
Yes, so it was a time of experimentation and governance, and it had a lasting effect on how India was ruled.
It's like laying the groundwork for what came next.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And lastly, we have to remember the Delhi Sultanate as this period of intense cultural exchange and blending, with Islamic and Indian traditions giving rise to these new forms of art, architecture, literature, religion.
And many of those blended traditions became integral parts of Indian culture, right?
Exactly. It's a reminder that cultures aren't static. They're constantly evolving, being shaped by how they interact with each other.
Absolutely. The Delhi Sultanate shows how transformative those exchanges can be. This has been quite a journey. We've covered so much: the political landscape, the architectural marvels, the cultural fusion, the economic impact, the challenges, and the lasting legacy of the Delhi Sultanate.
It's a pretty complex and fascinating period, right?
It really is. We started with the backdrop of India before the Sultanate, then dove into the rise of these dynasties and looked at all the ways they left their mark on the subcontinent.
And even though we've covered a lot, it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
There's still so much more to uncover.
That's the beauty of history. There's always more to learn, more layers to peel back.
And more stories to tell. So join us next time as we continue our deep dive into this fascinating period of Indian history. It's amazing to think about everything we've learned about the Delhi Sultanate.
I know, right? It's like we've been putting together this giant puzzle.
Yeah, with all the politics, the religion, the culture, the economics, it really creates this vibrant picture of what life was like back then.
And you know what's cool? Historians are still working on that puzzle.
Oh, for sure. There's always more to learn.
Always. Constantly finding new evidence, reinterpreting old sources, trying to understand this era even better.
It reminds us that history isn't static. It's this living, breathing subject.
Exactly. And I think the Delhi Sultanate is a perfect example of that.
Why?
Well, with its mix of, successes and failures, the way it blended different cultures and traditions,
Right.
it really gives us a lot to think about. It's a period that keeps on giving.
We have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We started by setting the scene in India before the Sultanate. Then we explored how these powerful dynasties rose to prominence. And of course, we couldn't forget those incredible architectural achievements.
Oh yeah, those were amazing.
And then we delved into the cultural fusion that happened, the economic impact of the Sultanate, and ultimately what led to its decline.
And even though it eventually fell, we saw how its legacy continues to shape India today.
Exactly. From the grand monuments to the languages spoken and the institutions of governance.
It's a reminder that the past isn't really past. It's still with us.
I want to touch on that question I asked earlier about cultural blending in today's world.
Yeah, the one about how cultures are mixing and influencing each other.
Exactly. Especially after learning so much about the Delhi Sultanate, it feels even more relevant now.
I agree. The Sultanate's story shows us that when different cultures come into contact, the results can be surprising.
Not always easy, but definitely
Right.
transformative, right?
Right. Sometimes challenging, sometimes enriching, but always leading to something new.
Like we saw, it could be architectural innovations, the evolution of languages, even new religious practices.
Exactly. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but those interactions created something unique.
And today, with the world so interconnected,
More than ever before.
we're seeing similar cultural exchanges happening everywhere.
It's true. Think about it, the movement of people across borders, the spread of ideas and technology, the fusion of music and food.
It's like a global tapestry being woven right before our eyes.
I love that analogy. And as we navigate this increasingly interconnected world, it's important to try to understand these complex processes.
To appreciate the nuances and engage thoughtfully.
Exactly. And I think that's where studying history, like the Delhi Sultanate, can really help us.
Because, just like the sultans of Delhi, the decisions we make today will shape the world for future generations.
That's a powerful thought. And those legacies, just like the sultanates, will inevitably be a mix of good and bad, reflecting both the challenges and the triumphs of our time.
It's up to us to make sure the good outweighs the bad.
Absolutely.
So to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Delhi Sultanate.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating period with you.
We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time for another exciting journey through history.
Until then, keep learning and keep discovering.